My name is Kim Robeen. I am going to be filling in today. Dr. Quello is not able to be with us. I am a faculty member in the School of Public Health and Health Services, and I am also going to be one of your lecturers on April 8th. So you're going to see more of me than just today. But anyways, thank you all for coming on this snowy day. Today's session is going to be on food and public health. And we are really lucky today to have two really great speakers lined up. We have Mr. Phil Durfler, who's here from the USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service. And we also have my colleague, Dr. Uriyoan Colon-Ramos, who's also with the GW School of Public Health and Health Services. Because they're going to talk about just a little bit disparate topics today, I wanted to take a minute and just kind of tie it all together and give you all sort of an introduction to the area that Dr. Colon-Ramos and I work in, which is public health nutrition. It's going to be the topic, obviously, for today. We're talking about food and public health. But again, the presentation that I'm going to be giving with Ellen Gustafson on April 8th will also address the same topic. So I thought this might be a good time to kind of introduce this. The field of public health nutrition is actually a specialty area within public health where we really focus on public health is the focus on health issues within an entire population. And so within public health nutrition, we're interested in food and nutrition issues that relate to public health. We do, in terms of the tasks that people who work in public health nutrition do, we do a lot of assessment, community assessment of nutritional needs and nutritional status, surveillance related to nutritional needs. We do program development and implementation around food programs, nutrition programs, as well as nutrition education, public policy work and administration, and research on all of these topics. So as you can see, it's kind of a broad catch-all relating food and nutrition to the health of populations. We're going to be talking today about two primary issues, food safety and sanitation, and then chronic disease prevention. And then Ellen and I will be talking about hunger and obesity on April 8th. These are some very big areas within public health nutrition. Other really hot topics in the field right now include anything related to food systems issues. I know a lot of you all are interested in food systems and health, and so are we in the field of public health nutrition. My own research really focuses on what are the health effects of chronic low-level exposure to things like pesticides, fertilizers, other food additives, other environmental toxins that we may encounter through the food and water supply. We also and Uri does a lot of work related to health disparities related to food availability in communities and how that exacerbates health disparities issues for different communities. But then another really big area of public policy we've been talking about in some of the previous lectures in this course center around food policy and public policy related to how do we encourage effective dietary behavior change? I know a lot of you have been paying attention to some of the issues that the New York City Department of Health has been bringing forward around portion size control for sugary beverages. There's interest in do we bring forward legislation to mandate that food companies regulate sodium content, trans fatty acid contents of their food. That type of thing is another area that we address within the field of public health and nutrition. So again, just wanted to give you a really broad overview of what the work that we do is. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Colon-Ramos to give us our first presentation today. So Dr. Colon-Ramos is a public health nutritionist, and she's also an assistant professor of global health in GW School of Public Health and Health Services. She's a native of Puerto Rico, and her research focuses on how food environments affect our dietary choices and non-communicable disease risk, especially among underserved populations in various global settings. She holds an undergraduate degree in nutrition and a master's degree in public affairs from Cornell and a doctorate in public health nutrition from Harvard. One of the things I think is not only has she just gotten a lot of academic training, she's also been out there in the field implementing some of her work. She spent a year as a visiting scholar at the Institute of Public Health in Mexico City. Is that where that is?
Cuernavaca.
Cuernavaca. And 3 months serving as a school feeding consultant in Paraguay, Bolivia, Dominican Republic, and Ecuador as part of the UN's World Food Program. So let's welcome Dr. Colón Ramos.
I've heard only good things about this audience and how knowledgeable the questions are and how fortunate I really am to be presenting to you today. So I'm really excited and happy to be here. I'm not going to be talking about foodborne illnesses, and I'm going to be talking about nutrition. And I think it combines the nutrient/foodborne illnesses, creates this interesting class today. And only you will be able to make sense of it at the end of it. No, I'm kidding. So today, I'm going to be talking to you about food and public health. And as a preparation, I was reading your blogs. And I felt a kinship to many of you because, like you, I started also interested in nutrition, in what are people eating and why are they eating it and where can I get some of that? I mean, quite frankly, I was one of those kids who spent most of their time in the neighbors' houses thinking that perhaps the neighbor's food was probably better than the one at home. Not because my mom was a bad cook or anything, actually. Apparently, she made killer rice and beans, according to my neighbors, who apparently also did the same thing I did. So they ate a lot in my house, and I ate a lot in their house. But the point is, I was interested in what other people were eating. I was interested in sharing their food. And when I moved here to the United States and started meeting people outside of my own culture, it was a way of getting to know what people are eating in other cultures. So it was a way of traveling to other cultures without actually being, leaving my table. So I think a lot of you share that same passion for food, what people are eating, where does it come from, how is it prepared, is it processed, and all of that is linked to culture, and it's linked to where these people live, and it's linked to infrastructure, it's linked to poverty, of course, it's linked to agriculture and economics. But all of that makes up food, and it makes up what we eat, and it affects health. And to me, there's no more interesting association than the relationship between food and health in communities, so that makes it public health. And then how we can enable people to make informed choices, so have the choices and have the information for them to make informed choices about what they eat, their nutrition, and also their health. So that's public health nutrition, and that's why I ended up in this tour of nutrition sociology and public health nutrition at the end of the day. Okay, so I want to exemplify that thought with this picture of a delicious looking cupcake, which I'm sure to many of you represents maybe a pleasure. It's already releasing serotonin, making you happier. And maybe for some of you, it's actually the depiction of pure evil, and you're getting stressed about just the picture, which is also not good for your health. And that's even before you take a bite of it. So you can imagine how complex this interaction is going to be when you actually eat what's in it. And so I like this picture, too, because it enables me to talk about the issue of trans fats, which is actually what I'm going to be talking to you about today. Before 2006, if you were getting this cupcake, you wouldn't be able to know what you were eating, whether there were trans fats or not. And most likely, the frosting and probably the body of this cupcake was loaded with trans fats. And trans fats look very nice in this frosting, but essentially they're blocks of lard, as you can see in this picture. And so if you take all the trans fats out of the oils or out of the frosting, this is basically what you're going to be eating. And it comes not just in cupcakes, but it comes in many other forms. Trans fats are basically formed from the process of partial hydrogenation of vegetable oils. So in order to increase the stability of the oil or the shelf life of that oil, or to make the oil spreadable like butter, this oil, these vegetable oils that are normally liquid, as you may know, are heated at very high temperatures. And those oils, they can be in spreads or even oils themselves that contain high levels of trans fats, are eaten all around the world. And this is an example of Iran's very delicious tart cherry rice. And we know that a high percentage of the partially hydrogenated vegetable oils sold in Iran are actually subsidized by the government as They're part of that ration program. So we know a little bit about what they're eating, and people are perhaps switching from things that were not as healthy in their mind. So for example, lard, to things that they thought would be a little bit healthier, like vegetable oils. And in fact, these oils are loaded with trans fats. This is an example of gallo pinto from Costa Rica. And they're loaded with trans fats, and they're making an even worse choice for their health because there's no information out there to tell them. In the case of Costa Rica, for example, in the 1980s, there was a campaign by the Ministry of Health of Costa Rica to push people away from the use of lards in cooking beans towards the use of vegetable oils. And you can see that the healthier, more health-aware people would make this switch and would be eating more of the soybean oil that was actually very high in trans fats, and they were increasing their risk of myocardial infarction, of heart attack. So that was interesting. But I told you a little bit about trans fats. Let me tell you what they are, why they're bad for us. So this is the form of a cis fatty acid. So fatty acid is what makes fats. And this is the cis form. So this is a type of unsaturated fatty acid that is very malleable. Therefore, it creates that liquid composition. And when that is heated at very high temperatures to increase the shelf life, one of the byproducts of that hydrogenation, most of the hydrogenations are not full hydrogenations. They're partial hydrogenations. So the byproduct of that is a change in the molecule of in the fatty acid. So now you see that in blue, you have the hydrogens next to the carbon. So now they're in transversal form. That's why it's called trans. And the molecule is more rigid, and it behaves more like a saturated fat, even though you still have that unsaturated bond. The case against fatty acids has been building up for quite some time. This process was first patented at the beginning of the 20th century as part of the full hydrogenation. And Crisco was one of the first products out there where it was vegetable oil shortening, basically creating vegetable oil into something that could be very solid and could be used outside. So it could be left at room temperature as opposed to butter, or it could be put in the fridge, and then you didn't need to wait for it to melt like butter in order to use it or to spread it. But the first studies against what is trans fatty acids started coming in the 1940s, 1960s, first looking at cancer, then looking at possible associations between trans and cholesterol. And then finally, it wasn't until 1991 where a lot of the studies and detailed studies came looking at trans fatty acids and risk of cardiovascular disease and risk factors for cardiovascular disease. And so basically, the evidence right now, it's very strong about the harmful effects of trans fatty acids related to risk factors for cardiovascular disease, and there's experimental evidence also linking trans fatty acids to insulin sensitivity and diabetes risk. But basically, trans fatty acids, why they're so bad, they're worse than saturated fat because they raise your bad cholesterol and they lower your good cholesterol. Saturated fat normally just raises your bad cholesterol, but it doesn't also lower your good cholesterol. It's also associated with inflammatory factors. We have evidence that it affects the endothelial, it disrupts the endothelium, and the mechanism, while it's still under investigation, there's pretty strong evidence that it's associated with all of these risk factors and adipocyte metabolism as well. So bottom line, trans fatty acids are bad for you, and we know it, period. But what has happened with that evidence, and why are we or are we not protecting globally the populations that are eating this oil, and do we even know what they're eating? Here in the United States, we have ways of protecting the consumers against trans fatty acids that are very different from outside and elsewhere. So basically, in studying what countries have done, and this is what I've been doing for the past maybe 5 years, you can summarize the responses into 3. And these are my own kind of made up responses. But basically, let's protect our people, let them eat cake, and let the industry sort it out. So let's protect our people. Denmark was one of the very first when this tons of information started coming out, epidemiologic information, experimental information about the effects of trans fatty acids. Denmark was one of the first ones who said, no more. In 2003, they decreed a legislative order saying this is the maximum amount that we're going to allow in all foods. So that covered prepackaged foods, foods in restaurants and chains as well. So all food, no more. And do you think this worked? Can I have a show of hands? Is this, I hear someone, I see someone shaking their head. No, this didn't work. Only one person has an opinion. But actually, it did work. Look at this graph. This is consumption of trans fatty acids in margarines and fats all the way to 2005. But look when it started, 1976. And the legislative order was in 2003. And actually, it was implemented in 2004. So what was happening before is that the industry had already started experimenting with ways of getting rid of trans fatty acids here. So in a way, by the time that the government said, let's get rid of this, no more for anyone in Denmark, and we're going to notify the European Union, no imported products coming into our country with trans fatty acids. But at the time, the technology did exist, and food industry had already been complying in a way with disappearing or eliminating the trans fats. But it was a very effective ban, and this is the one example that is illustrated as we should ban trans fats. I just want to insert in a parenthesis that, of course, my one bias. As public health nutritionists, we try to work outside of academia with food industry and with other sectors to enable the policies or the program changes that we want. So this is why I'm saying, see what has happened. Government implemented this ban, but the industry was almost already in the bandwagon, and this was possible. Now, of course, you need to take that with a grain of salt. So it did work. This is kind of old news, but this was published in 2006, looking at the fries and chicken from McDonald's and KFC in Denmark and other countries. And these are this is the content of trans fats in all of those countries. And you can see the variation, and you can see where Denmark is, thanks to the ban. And of course, you can see United States at the bottom. And it's a little bit shameful now. But this was in 2006. So, and if you're interested in finding more about what has happened in terms of bans in the United States, because we'll talk a little bit more about the United States as a whole, but also cities and counties in the United States have taken the example of Denmark and applied it. And these are the different counties and cities in the United States, according to the Center for Science and the Public Interest, who have implemented a ban or who have at least a decree out there. For example, Puerto Rico has a decree out there saying no more trans fats. I still want to see whether they have actually implemented that. That would be interesting to study. So yes, there's more information there. The United States chose a different approach. So their approach is let them eat cake, but tell them what the cake has. So in 2006, FDA said from now on, you're going to include the total amount of trans in the nutrition label. And does anyone remember what the nutrition labels looked like before 2006? Some of you, maybe you were too young to actually look. Maybe you don't even look at nutrition labels now. But I think you will for one of the homeworks. But basically, that's an important point, because we don't know how much people actually pay attention to these labels and how well they understand. And I remember maybe 2 years ago receiving a flyer of a pizza. We had just moved to Maryland, and there was a flyer for a pizza. And someone had written, and it was published, so someone had written, with trans fats, big exclamation point underneath. And I was thinking, this has to be a mistake. You're not advertising a pizza that has trans fats. They probably meant to say with no trans fats, and they knew, wait, is trans fats good or is it bad? I'm not sure, but it's in the label, so just put it in there. And then in magic marker, someone had written no in between, so that it read with no trans fats. So yes, there's some confusion about what does it mean? And are people even reading labels? And then where are the underserved populations? And how do they react to this? And are they able to understand? And are they going to be even more vulnerable because they don't understand, or perhaps they don't read these labels? But the good thing about let them eat cake, that approach, is that it leads to reformulation of products. So in a way, the government was saying, from now on, everything that's prepackaged and has trans fats, you have to label it. And of course, you're not going to want to label something that has trans fats, and you want to be better than your competition. So here's an example. This is actually from Canada of Oreos with 0 trans fats, Zereos. I think I will get confused with Cheerios at some point, but as long as you don't pronounce it. So it leads to this reformulation of products in country. And of course, we're talking only about prepackaged products. So it also leaves out a lot of other sources of food. So if you go to eat in, gosh, I don't know, Howard County, you won't know that what you're eating actually, whether it's made with trans fats or not, because obviously it's not labeled, and you don't know what choices those people in the kitchen are making for you. The other good thing about the FDA label is that it had some byproducts. This is soybean oil that is sold in Costa Rica, but that is also exported outside of Costa Rica to the United States. And in a study, we started seeing that the content of soybean oil started really high in 95 to 96, was miraculously reduced in the subsequent years. And we were wondering what was happening. In qualitative studies where we're asking, there's only one main producer of soybean oil in Costa Rica. And when we interviewed them, they alluded to the fact that they're preparing this product also for exportation to the United States. They're not going to make 2 different batches. So they're just going to reformulate everything that they make. And the Costa Ricans also benefit from this. Even though they never knew there was an issue, it was never labeled. They don't have the same labeling issues there. But now they were also benefiting from reduced trans fatty acids in preparation for the FDA. So the third approach is let the industry just sort it out. And this is an approach, I mean, clearly they have the technology to do it. Industry overall states that they have the best intention. They're responsible corporate enterprises, and they have the best intention for the public health good to eliminate trans fatty acids. And so, in fact, one of the examples of the very earliest cooperations with the industry comes from Argentina. So in Argentina, for example, in Universidad de La Plata, in La Plata, made a consortium or an agreement with one of the leading industries, an agricultural industry, to study the factors of cardiovascular disease in this particular community, and then to think about products that could improve that. And throughout this time, the issue of trans fats came up in the country. By that time, the industry and the university had come up with an oil that was free of trans fats, but had similar properties to what was being used. So when the issue of trans fats gets picked up in Costa Rica by the media, then it's almost like a domino effect. And this oil gets picked up, all of the other industries start switching voluntarily, because they want to voluntarily say that they're trans-free and being good with the consumers. So that's one of the first examples where the industry voluntarily switched. But actually the very first one, at least that I know of, comes from Holland. And so in Holland, back in the 1990s, Unilever, which perhaps you have heard of, it's a large enterprise, Unilever and the group of nutrition at Unilever, the Department of Nutrition and the Heart Association of the country got together to study the effect of trans fats and saturated fats in more detail. And they did an intervention, a feeding intervention study, and they reported that trans fats actually increased your bad cholesterol and decreased your good cholesterol. So that was one of the first seminal studies out there. Of course, Unilever was producing this. So from the get-go, they said, we are going to take the lead. We're going to be champions in this. We're going to take the lead and eliminate trans fatty acids from all margarines and spreads. And then that cascaded also. And eventually, that led to decrease not just in cooking oils and margarine spread, but also chains and trans fatty acid and restaurants. So this is from 1990, before the actual change. You can see in blue here the trans fats. Sorry, the rest is in Spanish. Well, saturated anyway. So in blue, and then just for comparison, in 2004 and 2006, that says chains and restaurants, and then McDonald's, how little trans fats they had compared to, of course, the United States in 2003. So that's the United States McDonald's. So even McDonald's in Holland, voluntarily, as part of this champion, Unilever, decided to voluntarily take out trans fatty acids. So yes, it can work. However, in both cases, you may notice that both in Holland and Argentina, the media and the press played a key role in pushing the industry to make this voluntary switch. They were like the trigger that made the switch. So can this be replicated elsewhere? As a result of what was being seen in Western Europe and in the United States and in Canada, the Pan American Health Organization convened a task force for a trans fat-free Americas. And you can see there were members of the industry, there were members of academia, and ministries of health discussing the aspects together. So discussing first, why were trans fats bad? Second, were there alternatives? Was there a will to change? And at the end of the day, they invited everyone. I was going to say they made everyone. They invited everyone to sign a declaration stating that they were willing to reduce or eliminate trans fatty acids in the food supply in each one of their countries. So there were representatives of 13 countries in this meeting, all over the Latin America and the Caribbean. And that decree was, invitation was signed by food industry representatives, and it was signed by ministers of health. And that was back in 2007. Well, a couple of years later, in 2009, we followed up with the food industry representatives to say, what have you done in the past 2 years to push this forward and to eliminate trans fats from the food supply in each one of these countries? And the response that we got back was very weak, not just in action or inaction, but also in response, period. Many of them didn't want to respond. And these are supposed to be the champions that signed a letter stating that they wanted to decrease. So you can tell, I mean, from that, I guess that suggests that food industry, without that incentive of the media or consumer awareness, or perhaps a nutritional declaration where the consumer is educated enough to read the nutrition label, it's very difficult to make the voluntary change by themselves. We also followed up with the ministries of health and representatives of the ministries of health a couple of years later. And we're about to report that from 2008, from the time that they met with the PAHO task force, until now, there has been a boom in regulations and in inclusion of trans fats in dietary guidelines in each one of the countries, in promotion materials, TV ads, but also in regulations for nutrition labeling, as well as some bans in trans fats, or upper limits, as we like to call it. So there is indication that we're moving forward. But just to summarize, there are many different examples of where trans fats are found, but we don't know the complete picture worldwide yet, of course. So we know that in the United States, it could be found still in cupcakes, perhaps in cupcakes that you buy at $5.99 per piece in Georgetown, but maybe in prepackaged and processed cupcakes that you find in corner stores, perhaps in the frosting. So you can think already about the social demographics of the populations that are going to buy these cupcakes and what are the health consequences of that, in addition to the infrastructure where they're involved. And now you're thinking like a public health nutritionist. But also in Costa Rica, as we mentioned, in Central America, the main source could be just in traditional foods because they're cooking with these oils. We know in South America, now it's in the chocolate cover of ice creams and these types of cookies where it's the hardest part to get out. I'm not sure if it's healthier. Don't ask me that. Is it better if they're trans-free to eat them That's a tough question. Of course not. But you know, it's worse if it's trans full. And then we know in other countries, it could still be in, populations could be getting it from when they go outside to eat, chains, fast foods, et cetera. And we know in India, a main source of trans fats is in the vanaspati, which is a substitute of ghee. It's a vegetable source of ghee, basically, a substitute. And then there are many unknowns also. This is a picture of oils that have been used elsewhere and then combined in many different soda bottles and are being resold for cooking. So God knows outside of trans what else is in there, of course. But also we don't know about the rest of the world. And the first step to start thinking about policies and programs to enable consumers to make an informed choice about trans fats, whether it's a ban or whether it's nutrition label or just plain consumer awareness, is to know where the main sources are and who are the most vulnerable populations to these trans fats. So with that, I would like to leave you with just that thought of what else could be done worldwide to take this nutrient that's a non-nutrient, that is non-essential and that harms, that should be easy to just take out. There's no advantage to having it in the food supply. It should be relatively easy to take out. We didn't have it before the early 20th century. And yet there are all of these complications and many more actually in terms of defining it and finding out where people are consuming it, how they're preparing foods, and why they're eating the way that they're eating. So just think about that. And thank you very much for your time.
All right, so thank you, Uri. I think gives us a lot to think about. And we're going to switch gears just a little bit here. We're still going to be talking about public health and nutrition issues, but we're going to switch over to food safety and sanitation. We are really lucky today to have Mr. Phil Durfler here with us today. He is the Deputy Administrator of the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Food Safety and Inspection Service. In this position, he plays a really integral role in ensuring the Food Safety and Inspection Service fulfills its core mission to protect public health by keeping harmful meat, poultry, processed egg products out of commerce and keeping consumers safe from foodborne pathogens. He's trained as a lawyer and has spent most of his career working on legal issues related to food. He's contributed to a number of significant food safety and inspection service initiatives to reduce the number of foodborne illnesses. We were just talking about the E. coli outbreak, the Jack in the Box E. coli outbreak backstage. He's been involved in all of these really interesting things. So I think we have a lot of exciting things to learn from him today. He's also played a really active role in promoting greater collaboration between all of the different organizations at the government level that are involved in food safety and regulation. Some of you may know from your readings that the USDA handles inspections of meat products, poultry products. FDA has certain responsibilities for other aspects of the food supply. And so it really is wonderful that we have someone like Phil who knows that whole breadth of food inspection issues to bring that all together for us and explain how the groups can work together, whether it'll be interesting to see whether he thinks that they always do work well together. But anyways, let's welcome Mr. Durfler to the stage.
Hi, how you doing? I'm just a bureaucrat. I am pretty straightforward and stuff like that, so why don't we just get to talk about this? I think you can't understand food safety in this country unless you look at the statutes that underlie the whole thing. Now, I'm not just saying that because my background is in the law. I think the statutes embody certain policy decisions that actually run all the way through how food is regulated in this country, and it's really important to understand that. Actually, I hope that this is going to be a whole lot more of a public policy talk than it is anything approaching a legal talk. Give you a little background. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is administered by the Food and Drug Administration, and it covers all foods except those that are covered by the other 3 statutes that we're going to talk about. So basically, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is the reservoir for any kind of food regulation, safety, and labeling in this country. The Meat Inspection Act obviously covers meat. There are amenable species of meat, livestock, and actually of some note lately, horses. I'm not sure if you've been looking in the paper, but in Europe there's a big problem because horse meat sort of has been found to contaminate hamburgers that people have been eating in Europe. We haven't allowed horse slaughter since 2006 because Congress said that we couldn't spend any money on it. They stopped that in 2012, and we're on the verge of allowing people to start slaughtering horses again, which is a big emotional issue, but it's not my job. The Poultry Products Act obviously covers poultry, chicken, turkeys. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. And the Egg Products Inspection Act is the most recent one. It covers pasteurized egg products. And if you understand that statute, you're way ahead of me, because I don't. This seems to be fairly straightforward. But the sort of interesting thing is, where do you draw the jurisdictional line between FDA under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and FSIS under the Meat Inspection Act? Let me just say, I think you've heard this, FSIS is part of the Department of Agriculture. So there are some pretty interesting things. George Bush, in his campaign to president in 2000, only talked about one food issue, and that was how surprised he was that cheese pizzas are regulated by FDA, but pepperoni pizzas are regulated by FSIS. Why does that make sense? Bagel dogs are regulated by FDA, and corn dogs are regulated by FSIS. Why does that make sense? Open-faced sandwiches are regulated by, open-faced meat sandwiches and open-faced turkey sandwich, regulated by FSIS. A closed turkey sandwich is regulated by FDA. Why does that make sense? I have no idea, and so we're just going to move along. But I just thought I'd give you something to think about. So we're going to talk about the policy judgments that are underlying the statutes, and let's just sort of look at that. So what I have here is a comparison of how FDA regulation as opposed to FSIS regulation. Then we'll try and talk a little bit about why this is the case. For FDA, there's no product review before the product enters commerce. It's made in a plant, it goes out the door, and then it's for you to eat. There's no inspector in the plant, and we'll talk about that in a second. But basically, there's no review. For FSIS, the product must be found to be safe and wholesome by an FSIS inspector before it's allowed to enter commerce. A very sharp contrast between the two agencies. Let me just say, there's a word, safe and wholesome. I may slip in and talk about adulteration. If the product is not safe and wholesome, it's adulterated, okay? That's just I tried to stay away from it. It's a little bit more technical, but anyway, well, if it's not safe and wholesome, it's adulterated. There is no mark of inspection on an FDA-regulated product. There's no indication of any government review at all. However, on every meat, poultry, and egg product, there is the FSIS mark of inspection, and it cannot move, the product cannot move in commerce unless it's given the mark of inspection by an FSIS inspector. If you want to know what an FSIS mark of inspection looks like, if you've got a can of chicken soup, or if you have a frozen dinner with turkey or roast beef or something like that, there'll be a little white circle, and on the top it'll say inspected by, and it'll say USDA, and then it'll have a number. The number is the plant number in our inventory where that product was produced. Inspection by FDA is infrequent. Up until recently, and maybe even now, inspection was as infrequent as once every 10 years. Actually, the new Food Safety Modernization Act that's in your materials and was passed by Congress about 2 years ago, that says for high-risk foods, there's going to have to be inspection once every 3 years, and for all other foods, there has to be inspection once every 5 years. The problem is FDA has yet to define what a high-risk food is, so we're continuing to see inspection once every 10 years. For FSIS, we have carcass in a slaughter plant. There is carcass by carcass inspection. Every carcass, before the animal is slaughtered, the animal is viewed what's called ante-mortem by an FSIS inspector, and then once the animal has been killed and is hanging, it's inspected by an FSIS inspector who decides whether or not it's adulterated. He's looking for various conditions. So it's a carcass by carcass review. In processed products, like frozen dinners that I talked about, there is an FSIS inspector who visits that plant once per shift. So again, there's this incredible disparity between what FDA does and what FSIS does. And then finally, FDA has the burden to show that there's a problem with food. FDA doesn't see the product until it gets into commerce, until it leaves the plant. And at that point, it has the burden of proving that there's a problem. Once meat or poultry gets into commerce, we have the burden of proving that there's a problem as well. But the thing is, before it can leave the plant, we have to find that the product is safe and wholesome and put our mark of inspection on it. And it cannot enter commerce unless we make that finding. So there is this great disparity between FDA regulation and FSIS regulation. So then the question becomes, how did this come about? And in order to find that, I want to organize my talk around 3 sort of pivotal periods in the history of the United States for food safety inspection. So the first pivotal period is 1906. And to understand why there is this broad distinction between how FDA regulates and how FSIS regulates, you have to go back to 1906. Both the Federal Food and Drugs Act, which is the forerunner of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and the statute that established what was the Meat Inspection Agency were passed on the exact same day in 1906. The difference was Congress thought it was dealing with 2 completely different problems. For FDA, for the Food and Drugs Act, Congress thought there's a problem with the contamination that occasionally comes up, so we have to deal with that. We have to give a government agency the ability to deal with that problem. But normally, their assumption was that food is safe. What's more common sense than that? Food is safe. And we're going to talk about that because that's a really important point, and you'll see how that changes over the years. But Congress's assumption in the Food and Drug Act was food is safe. FDA was original approach. There was a guy named Harvey Wiley who was the first commissioner of food and drugs, and he had what he called was his poison squad. And the poison squad were these guys who sat around the table and ate various things that might contaminate food. If they got sick, they knew there was a problem. If they didn't get sick, they thought there wasn't. Not real scientific, but it's how the United States regulated food for a long time. On the other hand, the meat came out of a completely different history. First of all, there was The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, which I'm sure you've heard of. The Jungle, Sinclair was a socialist. What he was concerned about was the working conditions of the people who worked in meat slaughter plants. So he wrote this novel about all these horrible conditions and stuff like that. The thing was, he wrote it trying to, as a sort of appeal to the public, to try and improve the conditions for workers in the plants. What the public said was, wait a minute, if the conditions are that bad, what am I eating? And so Sinclair was quoted as saying, I aimed for their heart and got their stomach. But there is this, this background concern about the conditions under which meat was being produced. And then on top of that, there was a report called the Dawes Report. President Theodore Roosevelt, who was president at the time, created a commission to look in the safety of meat and the conditions under which it was being produced in slaughter plants. And the report that they came out with was so damning that the industry got really nervous. They were afraid that they were going to lose the export market for their product. So as a result of that, they agreed to the passage of this meat inspection provision, which was really just a provision in an appropriations bill. It wasn't a separate act at all. The interesting thing was to get the industry's agreement to this statute, Congress essentially said the cost of inspection will not be borne by the industry, even though the people were working for the industry. Costs would be borne by the taxpayer. And so over the years since then, there's been a repeated effort to try and put user fees so that industry would pay for inspection. And it's never passed. And most recently with the sequester, you may have seen in the news that my agency was looking at the possibility of somewhere between an 11 and 20-day furlough of all of our employees. And as a result of that, we said, well, if we're going to be furloughed, we're going to furlough the whole agency on the same day. And since industry can't work unless there's an inspector there to put the mark of inspection on the product, the entire industry would have been shut down at the same time that we were furloughed. So to save $50 million, Congress would have cost the economy about $10 billion. So fortunately, on the end of last week, somebody came to their senses, and I get to work now. So the second major sort of pivotal period that I want to point out to you is the period following World War II. Following World War II, there were some significant changes in the American society. There was, as the veterans came back, there was a lot of movement away from the farms and into the cities and into suburbs. So people were moving away from the source of the food to live away from it. And so this created a couple of really interesting questions and issues. The first was with respect to poultry. It used to be that if you wanted a chicken, you'd walk into a chicken market, you'd say to the guy, I want that chicken, and they'd slaughter it, and then you'd take it home. They'd kill it, and you'd take home the bird, and you cut it up yourself and stuff like that. As people moved away from the source of it, they couldn't do that anymore. So what they were doing was they'd go to their supermarket, and the chicken was already dead, it was already dressed, and it was already packaged. So the question is, how was America going to ensure the safety of the poultry under those changed circumstances? The second thing that happened was when people moved further away, there was changes in how people were processing and manufacturing food. I mean, you used to be close to the source, and so you'd essentially get fresh food. As people moved away, the shelf life of the food had to be extended, and so as a result of that, they started using ingredients in food like preservatives to keep it fresh longer, and color additives to make sure that it retained its color. So as a result of that, in the late 50s, from 56 through 60, there was a flurry of food safety legislation passed. The first, it was the Poultry Products Inspection Act. And so there was this question, people, up until that point, poultry, chicken, turkey was subject to regulation by the Food and Drug Administration. And I told you how FDA regulates. They go in every once in a while. And people got really worried. And they say, how are we going to ensure the safety of the poultry? So they switched. They passed a new law that switched the model from the FDA model to the FSIS model. And poultry came under FSIS. So in 1957, the Poultry Products Inspection Act was passed. In 1957 as well, the cranberry crop was harvested, and somebody applied something to it, a chemical that people didn't know whether it was safe or not. So as a result, shortly before Thanksgiving in 1957, the entire crop of cranberries was recalled and destroyed. So the Thanksgiving in 1957 was the Thanksgiving without cranberries. And Congress essentially said, this can't happen again. So in 1958, they passed the Food Additives Amendment. And that essentially said that no ingredient, no preservatives, nothing like that could be added to food unless its safety had been established before it was added. It either had to be established through testing or else through general recognition. If it had a long history of safe use, if there were a number of articles published that established its safety, it can be used. In 1960, they passed the color additive amendments, which had a similar, which were very similar. They just extended it to color additives. And both of these laws contained what's called the Delaney Clause, which you probably never heard of. But the Delaney Clause said if there's any substance is shown to cause cancer, it's automatically deemed to be unsafe. And in the 70s, it was really controversial because the reason way they test whether or not the substances would cause cancer is they'd feed it at really high doses to lab animals, rats and mice. And people said, oh, we're all going to turn into mice and everything's going to be a carcinogen. And it turns out not to be the case. So there's that. So that brings me to actually, there's one little story. Let me just tell you this story. You may not know this, but in 1972, there was red dye number 2, which was what they used to make red M&Ms, was found to be a carcinogen under the color additive amendments. So as a result of that, there were no red M&Ms for a really long time. And on Family Feud one night, I was watching it in the 1980s, and the question was, what's your favorite color M&Ms? And of course, the thing that came out number 1 was red. But you don't know that because now you got red M&Ms all over again. So we'll just keep moving along. Okay, in 1993, 20 years ago, as you heard, there was the Jack in the Box outbreak. That was, there's hamburger chain, Jack in the Box. 623 people got sick with E. coli 0157H7 eating hamburgers at Jack in the Box. 4 kids died of HSUS. This was an outbreak of really monumental proportions. McDonald's had one a few years before, but it was much smaller and really didn't get the attention. But the Jack in the Box outbreak was really a watershed event. And as a result of that, my agency, because we regulated hamburgers, was forced to make 2 changes, 2 really significant changes. First of all, the administrator said that we would start testing on a regular basis ground beef in hamburgers. And if we found that it was positive for E. coli 0157, then the ground beef would have to be destroyed, or it would have to be cooked, or something else done to it. The only thing that you could do to it was cooking to kill the pathogen. This was a total change in policy. There had never been something that would render a raw product unsafe. As a matter of fact, in the late 70s, in 1979, there was a case involving salmonella in chicken. And the American Public Health Association sued the Department of Agriculture to declare salmonella in chicken a problem. And the Department of Agriculture, in its ultimate wisdom, said, no, that's not the case because ordinary cooking will kill the salmonella, so therefore it's not a problem. What was different about 0157 is ordinary cooking would not kill the 0157. And the reason is because 0157 is on the surface, and we'll talk about that in a second. It's on the surface of the meat. When you grind the meat, you spread the pathogen through the entire product. And so therefore, you're going to have thorough cooking in order to kill it. Ordinary cooking includes rare cooking. Rare cooking will not kill E. coli 0157H7, so that was a problem. So as a result of that, there is now what's called adulterants in raw products. The second major change that was really significant was we had to change how we did inspection. Up until that point, we did what's called organoleptic inspection. Organoleptic inspection means you either look at it, and if you see feces on it, you know there's a problem. You can smell it. If it's spoiled, you can smell it. You can taste it or you can feel on the surface, and you might feel gritty, and you know that the surfaces in the plant are not clean. But organoleptic inspection, you could look as long as you want. You could have thousands and thousands of people staring at a piece of meat, and you're never, ever, ever going to see a pathogen. So as a result of that, we said that we needed to have a new inspection system, which is called Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point, or HACCP. And what HACCP does is it says that the plant has to analyze its process, what's going on in the plant, and it has to find the places in the process where there was the possibility that the product was going to become adulterated, where it would become contaminated, and then it would have to develop controls for each of those points to make sure that the contamination does not happen. And then what it has to do is it has to validate the effectiveness of the controls that it's putting in place. And you validate it in two ways. First of all, you get either articles or some other kind of scientific proof that shows that the intervention is going to be effective. And then you actually have to run the intervention in your plant in order to show that it's effective. This is a totally new way of doing it. And then after you've implemented the intervention, you then have to continue to monitor it, make sure that it continues to be effective, and that's called verification. And verification is done by both the plant and by FSIS. The way we verify that the plant is controlling for E. coli 0157H7 is we test. And if we find it, we destroy it. FDA, as part of the new Food Safety Modernization Act, which I've already mentioned, has gone into what's called preventive controls, or at least the statute gives them authority to adopt preventive controls. This is a switch from the historical view of what FDA does, where food was deemed to be safe. Now they have to build prevention into their process to make sure that the product is safe. And one of the other groundbreaking aspects of the Food Safety Modernization Act is it gives FDA the authority to put in controls for raw fruits and vegetables as well. So, we've had peanut butter, found salmonella in peanut butter, salmonella in hydrolyzed vegetable protein, salmonella in peanut butter again. These preventive controls are supposed to address that. There's been outbreaks of listeria in cantaloupe, salmonella in lettuce, and E. coli 0157 in spinach. Again, these controls are supposed to address that. Now, after one of the articles I gave you is a guy who said, what good does regulation do? It's going to be expensive and everything like that, and it's really not going to have any effect. So this is not quite as dramatic as Uri's graph, but for listeria, and listeria is an environmental pathogen. It's a particular problem with ready-to-eat food. What happens with ready-to-eat food is you cook it, which kills anything that's going to be on it, but then it's exposed to the environment, and listeria is in the environment. It gets on the food. And listeria, it doesn't cause a whole lot of illnesses, but the illnesses that it causes are very severe. It's a particular problem in pregnant women because it causes spontaneous abortions, and it's a problem in old people like me because it kills you. So in 2003, we adopted a regulation on listeria. So what I just thought I'd show you with this chart is, I know the effectiveness of one regulation does not necessarily have anything to do with the effectiveness of other regulations, but I just want to show you the history of our regulation with respect to listeria. And this is only for products that are associated with FSI. It's only for meat or poultry where listeria is an issue with meat or poultry ready-to-eat products. So you see up to 1998, there was no attention paid to listeria at all. Then in 1998, we had a public meeting and we told industry that we were really concerned about it. And so you see that as there's sort of this dramatic and sort of slowly reduction up until about 2001. And then industry sort of says, well, where's the rule? There's no need to worry about it. So it sort of comes up until about 2003 when we published our final rule. And you'll notice essentially except for a little hiccup in 2006, we've driven it down to almost zero. It's not quite this good. If you go in there, with respect to like sliced deli meats that like Oscar Mayer, where you get it in a blister pack and stuff like that, we've really got controls inside the plant. Where there's a problem is when you go into your deli at your supermarket and you say, slice me some roast beef or something like that, where in those, that's where about 80% of illnesses associated with listeria, at least with meat and poultry, is coming from these days. We're working on the problem, but it continues to be a problem as we speak. So I just want to touch on two more things, because there's something that Mr. Andrés said. So I want to talk about imports, and again, notice the dramatically different approach to imports from FDA and FSIS, food imports from FDA and FSIS. For FDA, they look at about 1 to 2% of all imports of foods that come into this country. This is obviously a problem, and under FSMA, under the new Food Safety Modernization Act, FDA is given new authority. They can either enter into comparability agreements with other countries, but they've only been able to enter into one so far, that's with New Zealand, or they third-party inspections, where there would be third-party inspectors in the other countries who would do more inspection in the food production plants in those countries than there is going on right now. Unfortunately, there's no rules, no regulations, so nobody knows what that means. And then there could be increased FDA inspection overseas, again, to make sure that the plants are in better shape. The problem is Congress hasn't indicated that it's willing anywhere near to foot the bill that those kind of inspections are going to require. In contrast with that, you have what FSIS is doing. We look at 100% of all import entries of meat, poultry, and egg products that come into this country. This is a lot easier, though, because where FDA is regulating imports from about over 100 countries, there's only 34 countries that are eligible to export to the United States, and only meat and poultry to the United States, and only 28 of them are actually doing so right now. That's because we must find that the country is equivalent to US. That means that the country provides the same level of food safety protection as the US does. And if they don't do that, they're not eligible. Only 28 are eligible to do so. On an annual basis, the country has to report on what's going on with its food safety system, any changes, any developments. We used to, up until about 3 years ago, visit every country eligible to export to the US every year. But we're just not able to do that anymore, and we just think it's more efficient if they report to us, and then we visit them at least once every 3 years, and more frequently if the evidence shows that we should. And then finally, as I said, we're looking at 100% of the import. Those are our three safety. Now, just one last thing, and that's exports. The question sort of that Mr. Andrés raised was, do we just dump stuff on foreign countries? And the answer to that is no. FDA, it can't go into another country unless it meets the standards of the other country. For us, first of all, you have to get the mark of inspection, so therefore you have to meet all of our standards. But there's some interesting thing. There's a couple of interesting things that happens with other countries that I'll just mention real quickly. First of all, VSE is bovine spongiform encephalopathy. In 2004, we found the first case of it. And so other countries then became a little worried about our meat product. They limited the meat that they'd accept from the United States from animals under 30 months, and there has to be no bones in that product. In about 2005, there was a company in New York called Atlantic Veal that shipped a shipment of product with a spinal column in it to Japan. So Japan immediately has this huge crisis, and they're not going to accept our stuff anymore. And then Korea is not going to accept our stuff anymore, and China is not going to accept our stuff anymore. So as a result of that, we put in a special program where anything that we export is subject to special protections. Within the last 3 months, Japan has said, okay, we're satisfied that you can control it, and they've significantly lifted the restrictions that they had imposed on us as a result of that. The second thing that I want to point out to you is what's going on with ractopamine. Ractopamine is an animal drug. It's basically a growth promoter. It is safe. The World Trade Organization, through the Codex Alimentarius, has established a safe level at which ractopamine can be in food. And all the countries that are members of the WTO have to abide by the WTO standards, except for apparently Russia, because Russia has a burgeoning hog industry. They decided that if the US hogs come in as a result of growth promoter, they're going to be cheaper, they can't compete with it. And so as a result of that, they said they're not going to accept any pork from the United States unless we can certify that the pork is grown without ractopamine. So there's sort of a big issue going on right now. What exactly are we going to do? Are we going to sue them in the WTO, or are we going to change how we raise hogs in this country? So that just gives you a kind of an overview of how food safety is done. Thanks a lot for your attention.
So we have about 15 minutes for questions. Do we have any questions?
This one is specifically for Dr. Derfler. Doctor?
No.
Mr. Derfler, my apologies.
It's fine.
So, I've been paying attention to what you've been talking about in the news, and mostly we hear about spinach and peanut butter and cantaloupes and not meat or poultry or eggs. Mm-hmm. So are you prepared to say that the FDA is not doing its job?
No. No, not at all. I mean, they are, I worked at FDA for 18 years in the general counsel's office. I went back about 2 years ago to be associate commissioner for foods and didn't really like it. So I have a lot of love, though, for the Food and Drug Administration. They have a very, very difficult job. It's much more complex than ours, and not only that, foods is only part of what they do. They do drugs, they do cosmetics, they do medical devices, they do blood and blood products. It's an incredibly complex world. Recently, they've been getting a little bit more money, but they're really underfunded given the breadth of things that they have to do. I'm not entirely crazy about the FDA model somewhat, otherwise I think I'd still be working there. But they're trying really hard, and hopefully with FSMA, it will give them the authority to really become more effective and to increase their reach. And this sort of shift from you can just put it out there till you have to have preventive controls. The emphasis on prevention that exists there now, and hopefully if they put out proposed rules in January, and sometime hopefully in our lifetime they'll get final rules out, and then people have to follow them. So I think it's too harsh to say they're not doing their job. I think they're trying to do as well as they can. But I mean, it's sort of like, what's the hamburger chain in Los Angeles? What's a burger or something like that, where they In-N-Out Burgers. Yeah, In-N-Out Burgers. They really take pride in the fact that all they do is burgers. Everybody else gone and expanded to pizza and all that stuff, and they just kept burgers, and we just kept meat and poultry.
I'd actually like to ask a related question while we're waiting for another question in the audience. Our food safety system in the US has kind of evolved over time, and is part of the reason why we kind of have things in different agencies and different oversight of things. From time to time, there's discussion about bringing that all together under one roof. Do you ever see that happening? And is that a good thing or a bad thing? Are there some advantages to our current system?
Yeah. You want me to answer?
Yeah.
You can answer.
Not me.
I think it would be a really good thing. I think it'd be much more efficient. In a lot of ways, even though I emphasize the differences, in a lot of ways the statutes are actually more similar than not if you get right down to it. The problem, I think, is less to do with the agencies. It has to do with Congress. Different committees have jurisdiction, and a lot of it is getting the committees to give up jurisdiction, and they don't want to. They have oversight. So that's been a long-standing impediment to trying to get Congress to create a single food safety agency. But I think in the long run, it would be much more efficient, particularly not in either department, just as a separate independent agency like the SEC or something like that. That would be my personal, very much, this is only personal view, what I would hope for.
It's great that we have civil servants like Phil who have lifelong careers, because legislators come and go, but it's good to have that institutional memory.
And some of us go too.
Do we have other questions from the audience?
This question is for Professor Uri. If you could talk about how nutrition changes as demographics change, especially in lower to middle income countries as they transition to higher income countries?
Well, that's a really complicated question. In broad strokes, the way that nutrition changes, I'm not sure if you're all familiar with the nutrition transition, but basically that's what it would follow. What we have seen in broad strokes is as countries develop their infrastructure, take care of some of the basic epidemiologic issues, and as the demographic of the country then also changes, the fertility lowers, for example, the population also ages, we start seeing that nutrition-wise, the higher socioeconomic strata tend to have better access to foods, to a variety of different foods. So they choose to go for foods that are outside of their staple crops. So they diversify their diet, and with that comes the intake of foods that are imported, processed foods that are high in sugar, high in fat, and then these populations are also seeing a change in their exercise. So more of what we're doing now, less of what they used to do, which is moving and working in heavy agriculture, for example. There's a lot of migration to urban areas, so that also impedes the movement. So then you start seeing obesity and nutrition issues more in the higher socioeconomic strata. And then as those changes spread to the lower socioeconomic strata, then you start seeing that, for example, here in the United States, then it's actually the higher socioeconomic strata that are perhaps more health conscious that can make those informed choices because they have the information, or because they have the infrastructure, or because the environments enable them to do that, enable them to walk more, enable them to access healthier fruits and vegetables they can afford. And then you see the obesity issues at the lower socioeconomic strata. But that's changing a lot. For each particular country, it's a little bit different. And you can see aspects of a nutrition transition almost in speed. In some of the countries, in Ethiopia, for example, you'll be seeing increases in obesity and metabolic syndrome in a decade. Whereas in other countries, it would have taken 50 years to start seeing some of the obesity prevalence among adults and children that we're seeing now. So it's very interesting what's happening with the nutrition. But in broad strokes, yes, it's like an epidemic that starts with a higher socioeconomic status and then moves to the people who are more vulnerable.
One of the suggested readings that we have assigned for week 10 addresses that issue specifically. It's written by Barry Popkin at University of North Carolina, who's spent much of his career studying the nutrition transition. So.
And for those of you who are interested in the systems perspective of an approach, a systemic, I guess, approach to nutrition, it's an interesting question, and I think that's where the field exactly is moving, as Kim was saying earlier, where we're trying to understand the pathways by which the environment and changes at the environment level may enable or disable some of the nutrition choices of different populations. And so you can imagine the changes that you're doing up here at the environment level that you want to trickle down all the way at the individual level, and all the different pathways that has to go through, and all the potential stop points where it might impede or enable someone to change their behaviors. And I don't think that there's an answer for that yet. Obviously, we have to study that in many diverse populations and see how that would change by culture, by infrastructure, by policies implemented. It's interesting.
Other questions?
How do you see the implementation of regulations in regions with food insecurity and the developing world, and how do you think these areas are able to cope with this when there might not be enough food to begin with?
I guess that's for me. Yeah, that is a real concern. And so the main issue, so obviously I have focused more in Latin America and the Caribbean, where the burden of cardiovascular disease is highest and obesity is a big issue, as well as stunting, so as well as short people, prevalence of short people. But one of the main issues is that even as countries are interested in implementing one of these policies to ban trans fats, how do they monitor and evaluate? And how do they make sure that the implementation is happening? And so you nailed it right on the head. That's one of the main questions. It's countries lack resources, and so putting resources, first of all, let's just say, we have to break this into little success stories. So first of all, it's the success that the topic is featured in the policy agenda at all. So we're counting that as a success. And little by little, I think we can get to the point of monitoring and evaluation. There are many different ways of doing this. They do systematic surveys, talking specifically about Latin America and the Caribbean. Systematic surveys where it would be easy to collect, for example, blood spots of people as part of the routine, and you can do a quick screening for plasma level trans fatty acids there, and then see more or less the range. There is a multi-center study going on right now with 8 different countries that they're looking not just at plasma levels, but also validating that with adipose levels of trans fats. That's where you collect your trans. If you were curious, that's where we collect our fatty acids in the upper part of our buttocks, and you can see your consumption for the last 2 years, more or less, of what fats you have eaten. So in addition to doing that, of course, that's very expensive. And then the other thing that they're doing is taking a random sample of foods that are available at market and doing a systematic evaluation, controlled throughout laboratories, on where are the highest sources of trans, to get an idea of what would be feasible. So after doing that thorough study, almost like a pilot in these 8 different countries, then we get a better idea of what's feasible, where are we, where are the ranges, and then move elsewhere. Now we're talking about countries that are dealing with food security, issues of undernutrition, war, and other conflicts. Obviously, those are more pressing issues. Where's our next meal coming from, as opposed to, is this free of trans fats? So obviously, you have to put it into perspective and see what are the major pressing public health nutrition issues of this country and where we're moving. But the trans fat issue is an interesting one because it cuts across the entire globe, and you can see pretty much anywhere that it affects the most vulnerable populations that are also vulnerable to other issues. So outside of perhaps a minority of conflict countries, we're seeing an increase in cardiovascular disease and chronic diseases worldwide. So it's still pretty relevant. But the allocation of resources is a big question. Yeah.
Yeah, in countries with significant food insecurity, acute diseases, infectious diseases really are more of the big issues, and it's just a matter of how do we get food to these countries. But what we're really seeing, it goes back to that nutrition transition question, as we see countries starting to make those economic strides, and you have variation in food security, then you start to worry more about the chronic disease issues related to obesity. And that's, again, something that we'll be talking about on April 8th, that disparity between hunger and obesity, and how people can be hungry and obese simultaneously, and what some of those factors are. We see that here in this country, but we see it worldwide as well.
And I just want to emphasize, countries are moving in that direction already. We often think about global nutrition in terms of undernutrition and wasting, people who are really thin, people in conflict, and there are certainly those pressing needs. World Food Program is certainly very involved in those issues, but the major killers are now chronic disease, cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, heart disease. So countries are moving in that direction, and it's not just the higher socioeconomic strata that are affected.
So I think we have one more question down here in the front row.
So this goes a little bit with what you were just talking about, but on a U.S. level, is the way we talk about food safety in this class and in previous ones we had, you know, there's a burden to protect us from very clear poisons or E. coli or, you know, things that we don't need at all in our diet and don't benefit it. And then there's the blurry or like protect us from the things that can kill us over time, which are also, you know, poisons in a different way. At, you know, USDA and FDA, is there any kind of clear distinction between these two? Is there any tension between how funding is shared? Are they both automatically things you assume you do, or does one come in more reluctantly?
The basic difference is the sort of stuff with trans fats tends to be looked at as a labeling issue. And, you know, let them eat cake, as Uri said. You know, we're trying to provide as much information as we possibly can through the label, through the nutrition label, and then people structure their diets, hopefully, in as healthy way as possible, whereas opposed to the acute problems that you talked about will go right after. I mean, in my agency, there is a limited pot, you know, and right now, since the Jack in the Box outbreak, there's no question that food safety, you know, food safety, doing things about pathogens and stuff like that is clearly the emphasis of what we do. So is there a tension? You know, it's seen as a role that we've got to deal with, but there's no question about, at least in my agency, and I think at FDA, that, you know, food safety, keeping people from getting sick is our first priority, even though, as has been suggested, in some ways that may be short-sighted if you're having significant chronic problems in what you're eating and you die of cancer or heart disease rather than E. coli.
I think that's a debate we could have for quite a bit. Well, thank you all. I think we are at our class time for today. So thank you all for the good questions. And again, we'll pick up a similar discussion on April 8th, and I hope you all join us then. Thank you. And thank our speakers for today.